Hello, welcome back to SAS From Scratch. This is episode 8. We're going to be looking at by groups today and how we can process certain instructions within a by group. This also corresponds to chapter 8 in the prep guide, so if anything is unclear in this video, as always, go and use the prep guide for your primary source of information. These videos are mainly as a supplementary and a complementary addition to the prep guide. Okay, so let's get started. The first few things we have to understand are some definitions. So when we talk about by groups and by variables and by values, what do we mean? This is also from the prep guide, by the way, so this is not my content on this page. This is what I took from the prep guide. So by group processing means that we group observations in a certain way, and then we pass instructions to SAS to do certain things within that by group. Now, it is not exactly similar. It is similar, but not exactly the same as a group by statement with dplyr or with SQL, for example. But it is a good way of thinking about it, is that you're grouping by some variables, and then within that group you can make certain changes. By variables are simply by what are we grouping. So we've already seen by statements in the past. We can say, for example, if we run a proc means, we can do it by sex. We can maybe do it by sex and an age grouping. And so in that case, sex and age would be your by variables. The by values that we look at are the values contained within those variables. So if sex is one of our by variables, then male or female would be the by values that we expect in there. And so if we put all of these together, the by variables, the by values, we make what is called a by group. And these are observations with the same by values. And so what do we mean by that? If we group by sex, then our grouping will be all the observations that have sex equals F and sex equals M. So we've got these two by groups based on those two by values. And we can expand our by group. So if we say, for example, let's do something by sex and race, we are first and foremost going to be sorting by sex, because we're saying sex and race. There's nothing that prevents us from saying race and then sex, but the order in which we specify these by variables is important. So if you think back to when we used proc sort, if we, for example, say, okay, sort by sex and then race, you're going to get all of the F's for female before all of the M's for male. And likewise, if we, let us imagine, in a very simplified manner, that we have 3 races available in our data set. Let's say we have Asian, Black or African American, and white. But you would have many more than these, but for now we're imagining 3 races. And so if we do a group by sex and race, then our first grouping is going to be female, Asian. Our second group is going to be female, Black or African American. Our third grouping is going to be female, white. And then that repeats for the male sex as well. But the important thing is that when we look at, for example, let's take 6. If we look at 6, how many groups are there going to be for female? 1. How many groups are there going to be for Asian as a race? 2, because we've got Asian as a subset of female and Asian as a subset of male. That's important to keep in mind. If we sorted differently, if we sorted by race first and then sex, we would have Asian female, Asian male, Black or African American female, Black or African American male, white female, white male. And so what have we done there? If we then ask how many groups are there, for how many bi groups are there for the Asian race, that's 1. But how many female groups are there? Well, we've now got 3, because we've got a female group for Asian, we've got a female group for Black or African American, and we've got a female group for white. And so that's what it comes down to. It's important to know by what you're sorting, because you're going to alter your bi group depending on the order of the bi variables. And so keep that in mind as we move through this. The best way of thinking about it that I've found is to think about it in terms of a proc sort. You don't even have to think about it in terms of a proc sort, run a proc sort. And you're going to have to do that anyway, because whenever we use a by statement, we know that we have to have our data set sorted by those variables as well, in that same order. So when you run your proc sort and you look at that output, you should ask yourself, does that output make sense? If I had to do a grouping in my head and thinking through these bi variables and the order in which I've got them, does this make sense for what I'm trying to do? I think that about covers that. I'm trying to think if there's any other examples, but I think that's it. So let's move on to the next slide, which covers FIRST.x and LAST.x. Now, first and last are automatic variables that SAS creates for a bi group. And that fits in with the example I've just mentioned. So if we sorted by sex and then by race, we would have first and last for sex. You would have it for female once, and okay, I'm trying to find a way to explain this. It's hard to explain it if you haven't got the data in front of you. The chapter 8 in the prep guide, by the way, has very nice visual representations of this, so it's good to go and look at that. So let's start over. What SAS has is, if we think in terms of automatic variables like n and error, if you have a bi group in your data step, SAS will create automatic variables for each variable that's in your bi group. So if we have sex and race as our bi groups, as our bi variables, SAS will create first.sex, last.sex, first.race, last.race. And these are automatic variables that basically say, is this the first occurrence of sex female? Is this the last occurrence of sex female? Is this the first occurrence of sex male? Is this the last occurrence of sex male? And SAS does that with either a 1 or a 0. 1 means it is first or last, like a true flag. 0 is like a false flag. It is not first or it is not last. And so each row in your data set, if there's a by group, will have these variables automatic in the background for each of the by variables. And so if we go back to our example where we said we sorted by sex and race, we would also have first.race and last.race. But because we sorted by sex before race, we're going to have, for example, race Asian more than once. So we're going to say, okay, is this the first occurrence of race Asian within the female by group? If yes, then set that to 1. If no, set it to 0. We will also ask, or SAS will ask, is this the last occurrence of race Asian within female? Set to 1 or 0 if yes or no. And it will repeat that for male as well. And when we move to the code, we'll start to see examples of that. It is really helpful to know when your by group is starting or ending, because it tells you stuff about your data. We'll see on the next slide what we can infer from the values of the first and last, the combination of the first and last flags. And there's certain things we can do. We can count certain things, or we can sum certain things, depending on whether we're the first or the last one. And so in the example that we're going to look at today, when we get to the coding section, is we're going to have sort of an earnings statement for different departments in a fictitious company. And we're going to try and calculate the departmental earnings per quarter, the total earnings per quarter, and then the total earnings annually. And if you know when a certain department starts or ends within a quarter, you can calculate the earnings for the department. When you know when a quarter starts and ends, you can calculate the earnings for the quarter. And when you know when a year starts or ends, you can calculate the earnings for the year. And that's something that's used almost daily in the life of a SAS programmer, is this notion of a by group and a by variable. Especially because if you work with R, or if you work maybe with SQL, it is when you've got those vector operations where the language you're working with can look at an entire column at once. It's easy to just say, okay, group by, sum, and output. When you've got a language like SAS that steps through with the PDV through each row, it's important that the PDV can know where do I start and where do I end in a certain grouping. Excuse me. And that's again, we've talked about this so many times, but that's again the difference between SAS and a language like R. Is SAS works differently, and because of the way that it works and because of the PDV, it's really essential that we have these kinds of flags that tell us where does a certain group start and where does it end. Because if SAS cannot look at a column of values in its entirety, it needs to have markers that tell us where to start and end the processing for a certain group. And I think this will become more clear when we actually look at the code. So if you've managed to bear with me throughout the explanation, which could maybe have been a bit better, I think it'll become clearer in the code. But it's very, very hard to explain this in text. at least for me. I think it is something that is possibly very confusing the first time that you read it in the prep guide as well. And so when we get to the code, I'll try and take a bit more time to make this more clear. And we can take our time there, and we can try and understand it as best we can. Sticking with the first and last flags, there are 4 unique combinations that can happen. So we know that each variable, and this is per variable by the way, we know that each variable can either be flagged as first and or last. So let's look at the very last bullet point that we've got here. If there is only one observation in the by group, then it is both the first and the last record within that by group. So if we have, for example, a demographics dataset, and that demographics dataset has one row with sex female and race equals Asian, and there's only one row. There's only one subject or patient who is female and has been classified as Asian. If we then group by sex and race, that one record will have first.sex equals 1, last.sex equals 1. For that observation, first.race and last.race will also be equal to 1. And so if we look at any grouping of bivariables, and it tells us that first and last of that variable is 1, we know that only one such observation exists. If we have 2 observations, so let's say we had 2 Asian females in our demographics dataset. For the first instance where that happens, for the first Asian female that we have, we will have first dot, for argument's sake, let's go by race. First dot race equals 1, last dot race equals 0. For the second Asian female, we will have first dot race equals 0, last dot race equals 1. I hope that makes sense up to this point. Now, if we look at a particular observation and we see that first dot and last dot are both 0, then what that means for us is that there's going to be at least 3 observations with that by group. Because, or with that by value, because if you are neither the first observation nor the last observation, then you have to be somewhere in between first and last, which means you have to be at minimum the middle row of 3 records, or there could be more. If you had 5 records with a particular combination of by values, then observations 2, 3, and 4 would all have first dot and last dot equal to 0. And this can tell us interesting things in our data. And think about that a little bit while we move on towards the exercise, because something that the exercise is going to ask as well is, how can we use this in our quest to find data issues, for example. And it's very useful for that as well. I'm going to move on to the exercise because I think this will become much clearer with code than it is with slides. And so what I've done today was I made a custom earnings data set. I've already talked about that. There's department earnings per quarter, quarterly earnings, annual earnings. And what we're going to try and find is the department's earnings per quarter, the total quarterly earnings, and then the total annual earnings. And we're going to output this to either the log or the results tab, whatever we feel like. And then we'll come back to the last point down below, which says how can by groups be useful for finding issues. Now again, this is a custom data set, so I'm going to ask you to just follow along with me. And if anything is unclear, you're welcome to pop questions in the comments log below, and if I see them, I'll try and answer them. So I've already gone. Shows you how well I prepare, huh? Always winging it. So episode 8, I've already made a SAS program and a folder for us. I'm making a library here as well that's mapped to the episode 8 folder, because within episode 8 we've got this earnings data set that we want to refer to. And if I double click on that, this is what it looks like. So let's step through it. We've got year 2020 and we've got year 2021. We've got only these 2 years, and within each year we've got quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4. And for each quarter, we have 2 different departments in our fictitious company. We've got a consulting department and we've got a sales department. And each of these departments per quarter can do a number of transactions, and that's what this line item column is representing. It's not really useful for today to have this line item column. We're not going to be grouping by it, obviously, because otherwise we would simply, if we group by year, quarter, department, and line item, our groups will always just be a single item, and that's not what we want. But it's just a way of uniquely referring to a particular transaction. And that's what you'll find in real data as well, is that rows need to be identifiable. So if we say, okay, well, we're looking at the second transaction that the consulting department did in quarter 1 of 2021, we know it's this one, because that's the second transaction for the consulting department. This is what our data set looks like. So what we want to try and do first, or what I want to try and do first, is to show you what the first dot, last dot looks like for the year, the quarter, the department variables once we start grouping by them. Excuse me. I'm not quite used to the monologuing yet, so my throat is getting dry. Better. Okay. So let's look at that first. Let's look at the first and the last flags for these variables. Because we know that we're going to be calculating annual sales, we know that we're going to have to group by year, because we want annual earnings, sorry, not sales, earnings. We want annual earnings for 2020, and we want annual earnings for 2021. We also know that we want quarterly earnings. Now, we don't want all of the quarter 1 earnings across different years. In finance, people want to say, what were the earnings for quarter 1 of 2020? So we know that quarter is almost a subgrouping of year. Apologies. And then we also know that per quarter, we want to look at the earnings that each department brought in. So how much did consulting bring in? How much did sales bring in? And so what that means, again, if you've made the jump, well done. Department is a subgroup of quarter, which is a subgroup of year. And so that's what our by group is going to be. Our by group is going to be year, quarter, department. And we will look at everything in terms of that, in terms of that by grouping. So let's do that. The first thing that we want to do is sort. And also learn to type, apparently. I'm just going to call it earnings. It's just going to go to the work library. By year, by quarter, by department. And if I run this, and that data set I think is already sorted. However, it is good practice to always, if you know you're going to have a by group, sort beforehand by that by group, because it will prevent, in case you get new data in future or updated data, to make sure that the program runs without errors in future. This is our sorted data set, year, quarter, department. That makes sense because we've got year 2020 before 2021. We've got quarter 1 before quarter 2 before quarter 3. And within quarter 1, we've got consulting, which is C, before sales, which is S. Now, if we start doing our by groupings, what do we call this? Let's make it earnings statement, and we'll set earnings. The way we initialize a by group is with a by statement. Notice that usually we would have a by statement within our procs. So previously, when in all of our previous episodes, proc sort, proc print, proc means, proc fric, all of that stuff, we've played around with the by statement. Now, if we put a by statement within a data step, that initializes it for by group processing. So let's, as we've said, we're going to do it by year, quarter, and department. And let's start, first of all, and I'm going to keep an eye on my camera location. I might move that around just so that it doesn't block the necessary columns. But if we look at, we're just going to call this first underscore year, and we're going to say set that equal to first dot year for me. Now again, this is a reserved way of referring to the flags within the by groups. Recall as well that you can't have a dot in your variable names. It's not the valid var name v7 standard, so we're not doing that. And if we, and my camera is blocking, so let me make sure I move the camera and nothing else. You know what, I'm going to move into this corner for this episode and we'll see how it goes. That might actually be a better location anyway, so maybe I'll just stay here for future episodes as well. If we look at our data set, and I might maximize that. Nah, that's not going to work because then I'm blocking again. Year, quarter, department, line item, earnings, all perfectly fine. That's what we had earlier too. Now notice first underscore year, which we've set to the first dot year automatic variable, is flagged with 1 in the first instance where we have 2020. And it's flagged with 0 for the second, third, etc. instances. Now if we scroll down, note that it stays 0. It stays 0 until this point where 2021 starts. And we have the first instance of a new year value. And I hope all of the rambling and the waffling when I was trying to explain it in the slides starts to make sense now. I'm going to do the same for last underscore year. So let's try that out. Going to close that. And now, if we scroll all the way up to the top, the first instance is flagged as 1. The last instance is flagged with 0. Notice that for the second instance, it's neither the first nor the last instance, so it has 0 for both, third, fourth, etc. And when we get to the last row for 2020, we see that last has been flagged as 1. For the first instance of 2021, we can see that the first flag has been set to 1. And if we scroll all the way down to the last instance of 2021, we can see that SAS has flagged that with a 1. Now, let's do the same for the quarters and for the departments as well. And I hope that I don't make any mistakes here, but we should spot it when we look at the data anyway. Okay, let me double check myself. First and first, last and last, first and first, last and last, first, first, last, last. Okay. And, okay, everything fits in brilliantly. I'm going to scroll us all the way back to the top. If we look at the very first row that we have, keep in mind we've grouped by year, quarter as a subgroup of year, and department as a subgroup of quarter and year. If we look at the very first line item, is it the first instance of year? Yes. Is it the last instance of year? No. Is it the first quarter within this year? Yes. It's the first instance of quarter 1 within 2020. Is it the last instance of quarter 1 within 2020? No. That's over here by record date, because there's where quarter 2 2020 starts. Is it the first instance of consulting within quarter 1 of 2020? Yes. Is it the last instance of consulting within quarter 1 of 2020? No. That's here in record 4, because here the department ticks over to sales instead of consulting. Now let's look at sales. Is it the first instance of the year 2020? No, because we can see there's a bunch before it. Is it the first instance of quarter 1? No, there's a bunch before it. Is it the first instance of the sales department? Yes, within quarter 1, within 2020. Let's move on to row number 8. Is it the first instance of year 2020? No. The last instance? No. Is it the first instance of quarter 1? No. Is it the last instance of quarter 1? Yes, because here it ticks over into quarter 2. Is it the first instance of the sales department? No. Is it the last instance of the sales department for quarter 1 2020? Yes. And if we tick over into quarter 2 and the consulting department, we can see, for example, we're still in 2020. It's the first quarter. No, it's the first instance of quarter 2 in 2020. It's the first instance of the consulting department within Q2 within 2020. And that's where, when I mentioned earlier, if we go back to that demographics example I use, if we sorted by sex and then race, that would create something different than sorting first by race and then sex. Because depending on how you list out these variables, they are combined in a certain way, and you need to find the most logical combination for what you're trying to do. Because, for example, consulting occurs several times in this data set. This is not the very first time that we've seen the consulting department, but it is the very first time that the consulting department... My goodness. This is the very first time that the consulting department has been... has occurred within the by group of quarter and year before it. And now I'm going to comment out these bits. I'll leave the code in here as an example, but I'm going to comment it out because I want the data set to look cleaner. And now we're back to our standard data set: year, quarter, department, line item, and earnings. And what we're going to do is, for this group of consulting line items, we want to add up what the total is going to be. For this group of sales line items, we want to add up what the total is going to be. Then for this entire Q1, we're going to add up what the total is. And then we're going to do the same for Q2, we're going to do the same for Q3, so that we finally can get a total for year 2020, and then we're going to repeat that for the year 2021 as well. The way we're going to do that is, let's first do the annual earnings. So what do we know? If we have the first instance of a year, we should reset our annual earnings to 0. So let's do that. If first.year, then annual earnings equals 0. Makes perfect sense up to this point. Now we're going to learn about something called an accumulator variable, and I don't want you to worry about it too much, because we'll look at it again, I believe, either in chapter 9 or in chapter 10. What I really want you to focus on is the use of first dot and last dot. But essentially, if I say annual earnings plus earnings and just cut it like that, the annual earnings column will be a cumulative sum of earnings. And let's look at our output data. So here's earnings. So if I, for the first instance of year, I set annual earnings equal to 0, and then I say keep adding earnings as you step through the data set. So that gives you a sort of a cumulative sum. And if we run this, note in Q1, very first line item, our annual earnings equals our earnings. For the second line item, 840 plus 1054 gives you 1894, plus 913 gives you 2807. So this is a cumulative value that keeps adding up as SAS steps through the data set. So when we get to the end of 2020, our cumulative sum is 19248. As soon as we tick over to 2021, we're going to first.year being true, because this is the first instance of 2021. We reset to 0 and we add the earnings for 2021 in there. And so this is 339 plus 781 gives you 1120 plus 173 gives you 1293. And so it starts over for 2021. Now we're going to do the same thing for quarter within year, and then after that department within quarter within year. And it's going to work exactly the same. So we're going to say if first dot quarter, then quarterly earnings equals 0, otherwise quarterly earnings plus earnings. And because in our original by group here we have year then quarter, this is automatic that it is quarter within year. If you wanted to add up all the quarter ones without regard for year, your by group would have to be by quarter. And then you can run if first dot quarter, quarterly earnings 0, otherwise quarterly earnings plus earnings. So I hope that's starting to make sense and starting to click. And so we can do the exact same thing with department. We can say if first dot department, then department earnings equals 0. Otherwise, well, not really. Otherwise, we're just adding. It's always going to happen, regardless of whether it's first or not. Department earnings plus earnings. I'm going to run this. Hopefully, there's no mistakes in it. No, looks all right. So there's our department earnings. There's our earnings for each line item. There's our annual earnings, just adding up and up and up. Let's look at our quarterly earnings. So for the first quarter, we expect that it will match our annual sales because it's quarter within year, and it does. So annual and quarterly earnings are all the same for the first quarter. When we tick over to quarter 2, we note that quarterly earnings has reset, and we're using the value 189 plus 524 gives you 713 plus 327 gives you 1040. And when we tick over into quarter 3 again, we notice that the quarterly earnings is 593, so it's reset again. 593 plus 148 gives you 741, etc. And the same thing happens with the departmental earnings. So for the first quarter, where the department stays the same, notice annual earnings, quarterly earnings, departmental earnings, those are all the same. As soon as we tick over into a different department, our earnings resets, and we take from earnings 261 here, and we add that in as the first earnings for that department, for that quarter, for that year. And then 261 plus 974 gives you 1235 plus 183 gives you 1418. So that's I think the best possible demonstration of how these by groups work. So now what do we know? We know that the last record of each of these by groups means something. The last row for consulting for quarter 1 for 2020 is the total earnings that the department made within that quarter, within that year. We know that the last row for quarter is the total quarterly earnings across all departments for that quarter, for that year. And we also know that the last row for each year is the total annual earnings across all quarters and across all departments. And so let's try to output that. And I've already given you the keyword here, which is last. So we can say, for example, if last.department, then put, and if you've not watched episode 5, episode 5 is really useful to learn more about the put and the put log statements. I'm going to put 3 asterisks here just for display purposes and for us to remember that this was the third by variable in our by group. So that's sort of, if we tunnel down into our earnings, this is 3 levels. This is the third level. And then we're going to say, okay, department, earnings for year and quarter, and then let's just say was. Now let me run this, and in fact I'm going to take this out just so our code stays a little bit cleaner. So I'm going to run this and let's see if this works. Let's go to our log. Okay. Department Consulting earnings for year 2020 Q1 was 3510. Department Sales earnings for year 2020 Q1 was 2128. And if we go and look here at consulting, 3510 is in our last record. Again, remember we've added cumulatively. For sales, 2128 in quarter 1 is our last record. And that's what we've got here as well, 3510, 2128. And so this also now repeats for Q2, for Q3, and for Q4. And then it jumps over to 2021 Q1, 2021 Q2, Q3, Q4, etc. And so that gives us our departmental earnings, which is here, within quarter, within year. We want to also see the quarterly earnings, so we're going to say if last.quarter, then put.
Here's what I found.
I swear I am going to murder Siri today. Quarterly earnings for year, quarter was, what did we call this? Quarterly earnings, I think. And let's look at our log statement. So, department consulting, department sales. What were the quarterly earnings across these two? If we add up 3510 and 2128, we'll get 5638. So this is a little grouping, quarter and the sales within it. This is a little grouping. There's quarter for Q2 and the sales within it. But I made a mistake here. There shouldn't be a space. That'll look neater. But essentially, we're 2/3 of the way there. We've got these little groups of departments within quarter and then quarterly totals. And you can already see where this is going to find the annual earnings. We can say if last dot year, then put annual earnings for year Q quarter was annual earnings. And that should be, I think, as simple as that. And if we go and look at our log, Let's look for that single star. Annual earnings for year 2021 Q4. Oh, sorry, we don't actually need the quarter. Yeah, that doesn't make sense, huh? Annual earnings for the year. But note that it's not wrong when we refer to quarter in our put statement, because the last instance of 2020 does have quarter equal 4. Let's go back to our log. So annual earnings for, no, I'm supposed to rerun this and I didn't rerun it. So now we have annual earnings for year 2020 was 19248, and annual earnings for year 2021 was 14777. I hope this example was useful. I hope this more clearly explains by groups, hopefully more clearly than the slides. Again, for me, this is something that's difficult to explain using only words. I think you can't really do it without code. I think the visual representation, again, in the prep guide is really good. Go and consult your prep guide as well. And then let me quickly kick it back to our exercise slide. And let me move myself back up here. Where do I normally go? I think it's here. Okay, I'm back. So we've done this. If we wanted to output it to the results tab, we would just change, we would just put print file in the data step, and we did that in, I think, episode 5 as well. So go back and watch that if you need a refresher. Now, extra credits. How can by groups be useful to find issues in a source data set? Let's jump back to what we had in episode 7. I'm going to open this DEMOC data set that I made for episode 7. In a demographics data set, we would expect a subject to have a single record. So this is just one example of where you can use it. And so if you make a by group by subject ID, you would expect that first.subject ID and last.subject ID have to both be 1 for each row. Because recall, if there were 2 instances of subject 00001, then the first row would have first.subject ID equal to 1. The second row would have last.subject ID equal to 1. And 0 otherwise. So if you know that first.subject ID and last.subject ID are not both 1, that means you've got more than one record for a particular subject. That's something that you can put it out to your log, you can flag it for yourself somehow. And you can go and query that with your vendor or whoever you got the data set from. That's one instance. Something else we can look at, it's not as accurate, but I can give it to you as an example. So for example, if we have data sets that measure ECG measurements, your electrocardiogram measurements, that's your heart rate, your QT interval, that sort of thing. That's usually done in triplicate. So 3 records are usually taken, and then we'll look at the average of that to sort of get a more holistic view of what's happening. So let's say, you give a subject a certain drug that maybe tries to correct whatever it might be, heart rate or atrial fibrillation or whatever you're looking for. And then an hour later, you take a triplicate measurement and you expect that for that subject at the 1 hour time point you're going to have 3 measurements. You might say, okay, more than 3 measurements, fine, we'll just keep taking the average, but I can't have less than 3 measurements. And so something you would try and look out for in that case is that for each subject and time point, so you could group by subject, group by time point, you would expect that there should be at least somewhere in there should be a row that has first dot and last dot both equal to 0. Not the best way of going about it. Something like summing the number of records by subject ID and time point would be better. You could use a proc means for that. You could examine the n variable. You could use proc sequel, and you could do a count. But it's just an example of things that you can derive, or things that are implied by the values of these variables. That's about it, I think, for today. That wraps it up. Let's see what we're doing next time. Okay, so episode 9 next time. That'll be next week. So I'm gonna try and release these on Mondays and Thursdays. So only week after next, after you've seen this episode. We're going to be looking at creating and assigning new variables. We've already done that. If we look at this, that's the creation and assigning of a new variable. So we're not going to learn too much there. Summing of accumulator variables, we've already done it here. So we'll look at it. We might look at it a bit more in depth, but we're not going to. It's not going to be completely new to us. The if-else statements, we've seen some instances of that already. But if else, we'll look at the syntax. Not sure if I'll also look at the do statement. I think I might just throw that in there as well. And then we're going to look at the delete statement. Now, in the same way that output takes whatever is in the PDV and puts it into an output data set, the delete statement essentially takes what's in the PDV and says, oh no, sorry, chuck that out, don't send it to the output, we're not going to need it. So we'll look at and that one is at that statement as well. That's for next time. That's for next week. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been useful. You're welcome to leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you want to be notified of new episodes. But until next time, cheers. Have a good day. Bye-bye.